state your name?
Yes, I'm Bert Rice.
Dennis Noah.
Donna Filosa.
Robert Smith.
John Estel.
Russell Stewart.
George Forrest. Jack Schofield.
Vince Zegowitz.
Bobby Hovis.
Susan Stewart Miller.
Jan Scruggs.
Can you talk me through the Vietnam Memorial?
Well, that's a quick question with a very lengthy answer. But it all started in 1968 when I got out of Bowie High School and volunteered for the Army.
I was 18 years old, didn't do anything. Went to college, worked at a hospital part-time, cut grass.
I was like around 27. I'd gotten out of high school. I didn't go to college, and I was working as a secretary.
I was in college, and the Navy paid my last 2 years of college. I went to University of Cincinnati. The Navy paid my last 2 years of college, and then I owed them 3 years.
I was a college student, University of California. I took my BA in July and went into the Army in October.
When I finished high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I ended up at Morgan State University in Baltimore, which at the time was a land-grant college, which meant that all males had to take ROTC for 2 years.
I enlisted right out of high school in the reserves, and I did 6 months active duty, went to Parris Island and then to Camp Lejeune, and then I came home to my reserve unit, and at that point I got into college, and I got into a commissioning program, so when I graduated from college I was commissioned as a second lieutenant.
Well, I was attending Providence College in Rhode Island, where I was born, and I was kind of bored with life, so I enlisted in the Air Force.
I was always interested in the military. I tried to get into the Naval Academy when I graduated from St. Mary's, but back in those days you had to have 20/20 vision uncorrected without glasses, and I didn't have that, so I couldn't get in there. And I went to the University of Maryland on a lacrosse scholarship and ended up hearing about their ROTC program, and I said, this is my chance, all's not lost because of the Naval Academy. I can still get in the military through that avenue.
I think the reason I joined the military, there might be 2 reasons. Number one, I didn't want to get drafted because I knew that if I was drafted, I'd be going into the Army and probably into the infantry, which was not something I dreamed of doing.
How long did you serve for?
34 years.
5 years.
2 years in each.
2 years.
26 years.
For 30 years and 16 days active duty.
So you decided to enlist. What?
No, he was drafted.
No, I did enlist.
You did enlist?
I enlisted to avoid the draft.
I see.
Well, at that time you were either going in the Navy or you were going in the Army.
I knew I wanted to join the Navy Nurse Corps. So of course, before you could enter the Navy, you had to, in those days, be a graduate nurse, an RN, and possibly a degree if you wanted that. It's just something I wanted to do.
Why did I decide on it? Well, I really didn't decide that. I was drafted and I enlisted on top of that.
I grew up in a small community in West Virginia where almost all the men had been in the military. We had the draft in those days, and so if you didn't volunteer, the draft would get you. I volunteered. Let me tell you how I chose the Marine Corps. I didn't play sports when I was in high school. I was in the band, and that wasn't as manly as playing football or some of the other sports, and so I just felt this need. I needed to go someplace where I could prove my manhood. So I chose what everybody said was the toughest service, the toughest boot camp. And I wanted to prove myself that I was as tough as anybody else.
Did you go through boot camp?
Oh, yes.
Our boot camp was the Navy Indoctrination School up at Newport, Rhode Island.
The purpose of boot camp, or basic training, it was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was to turn people who less motivated and make them motivated, and to give them direction and positive guidance.
It was very cold. I went November, December, and January.
In my case, it was 30 days. We had 30 days to learn how to be an officer.
I went to Waukegan, which is the Great Lakes Naval Station, which is right on Lake Michigan. And I was there in March, and it's kind of chilly. If you take a look at boot camp then and boot camp now, or basic training as some services would call it, it's a lot different because they were trying to get us through and get us to Vietnam quickly. So your training was shortened is what they do now. Their training cycles are much longer now than we had.
I went into the Army. They sent me to the language school for a year, intensive training in Vietnamese. When I got out, I wanted to go to Vietnam. This was 1961, but they didn't send me to Vietnam. They sent me to the National Security Agency, NSA, where I worked for the rest of my military tour.
So what did you expect going to Vietnam? Did you expect what you got?
Total surprise. First of all, having not read a lot about Vietnam, or Indochina as it was called, not having known the history of the battle of the Vietnamese people, that they had fought the Japanese, they had fought the Chinese, they had fought the French, and now they were fighting communism.
There was a show called Combat. You ever see that? Where the guys go out and they kill the Germans and they take buildings and everything is really great and they get shot. By the next week they're fine again. That's kind of was our version of combat, except for my father, who was, spent 12 years in the military in the Pacific during World War II, but he didn't talk too much about it. So our idea, and you talk to some Vietnam veterans, ask them about the show Combat.
The vision that I had is that we would do assault landings like World War II, where they stormed the beaches and whatever.
When did you go to Vietnam?
I got there in June of 1968.
When we landed, we went over by ship. We landed in a little town called Quien Nhân.
When you would approach the coastline of Vietnam in an airplane, you would immediately be taken with the overwhelming, beautiful greenness of the country.
When I first got there were about 18,000 American troops.
Then I was sent to Naval Hospital Guam, which received aerovacs from Vietnam. That's where I got the Vietnam casualties.
We went to Vietnam, and within a day of getting there, I was in a firefight. And I wasn't really quite sure what it was all about yet, because our training was so shortened because there was such a shortage of medical personnel.
I wasn't prepared for the emotional impacts of combat. That kind of takes you by surprise, and you just kind of learn to deal with it.
When I look at Vietnam, the damage was just unbelievable.
So what was your job like in Vietnam?
I had 4 different 3-month jobs. The first 3 months was the readout of film that our planes were taking over South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Laos, and doing the targeting of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese armaments.
I had the intensive care unit. I worked a lot in the operating room, in the emergency room. I got patients right off the battlefield. Oftentimes we just have to cut their uniforms off on a stretcher.
I was a company commander at that time, which meant that I had a rifle company of about 126 soldiers. These were basically infantry soldiers, combat trained.
It's called an AFSC, which is your Air Force specialty code. And my specialty code when I was in the Air Force, likewise in the Army, was ordnance. I worked with munitions, explosives. So that's what I mainly dealt with while I was in Vietnam, was different types of explosives that were loaded on aircrafts or landmines, booby traps, things of this nature.
Well, I was a helicopter pilot, and we did everything that needed a helicopter. We put troops into the field. We resupplied them with food, water, and ammunition while they were in the field. We did medevacs when they were injured. We did visual reconnaissance, so the commanders of the units needed to get up so they could look at the terrain from some altitude.
Since I could not go to the front lines, I graduated at the top of my class, so they made me an instructor. So I taught the men who were leaving to go to Vietnam and serve.
Well, your first job really is, most people think that a medic's job or a corpsman's job is to treat the most badly wounded. It's not. It's just the reverse. In other words, if you're in a firefight, you're engaging the enemy and there's shooting going on, and you've got, say, 6 Marines down, 3 of them are very serious, they're not going to get back up, and 3 of them have minor wounds. My job was to get those 3 Marines with minor wounds, patch them up, reassure them they were going to live, and go back and start shooting again. And then when the shooting stopped, then we took care of the guys that were badly wounded, because the firepower, the amount of firepower you could put against the enemy was very important. And 3 rifles down, 3 weapons down was a lot of firepower.
The problem with the military back in those days was that they were not trained to understand what signals intelligence was. They didn't know where I was getting my information. I told them, I'm intercepting the guy across the hill. I'm listening to his communications. I know what he's doing. But they didn't understand. 1967, the Battle of Dak To, I warned the division commander of the 4th Infantry Division that he was about to be attacked. He didn't believe me. That ended up being in the Battle of Dak To, one of the biggest battles during the Vietnam War, where the casualties were huge on both sides. It wouldn't have gone that way if he had believed me and if he had taken warning. The same thing happened during the fall of Saigon. I went to the ambassador. I warned him we were about to be attacked, that the North Vietnamese were going to overrun Saigon. He didn't believe me. And the result was, of course, a disaster at the end.
So what were the conditions like in Vietnam while you were serving?
It was really hot.
It was, I would say, austere.
I was in the Central Highlands, a place called An Khê. It was hot in the summer and about in the 40s in the winter.
Really kind of a nasty place. But we had to learn about things. We had to learn about the customs of the country. We had to learn about how do you survive in a place like this? How do you keep your feet dry because it's so wet and during the rainy season?
You know, my first memory, I got off the airplane when it landed in Da Nang, and you just like, boom, the heat and the humidity and the stink. They had this, we didn't have plumbing for the toilets, so they had these wooden little outhouses, and underneath them there were 55-gallon drums that had been cut off, and they put jet fuel in it. And so when it got full, they'd pull them out and they'd set fire to them, and it smelled really bad. And so,
What was life like on a day-to-day basis?
We worked 14 to 16-hour shifts. It could be longer. One of the things that you always have to deal with is, could the base come under fire where we were?
Every morning, or depending on when my shift was, grab my rifle, ammunition, and flak jacket and helmet and go to work, quote unquote.
Our hospital, which I went to in 1968, went from 100 beds to 700 beds within about 30 days. So that was right after the Tet Offensive, when the war just kind of exploded and casualties were just massive. So we were getting maybe 5 airvacs a week full of Marine casualties within about 24 hours of injury. So it was very intense.
We had all sorts of troops in Saigon, where the hospital was. And we had 5 stories to our building, and I would go out on one of the balconies and have a wonderful view of the whole situation. I happened to look across the street where there was rifle fire, and as I just happened to look at one man, he fired a shot right directly at me. The bullet hit this far below the wall of the balcony where I was standing, and it ricocheted up and hit the ceiling, and it dropped down to the floor, and I could pick up that bullet, and I have it to this day. And the tip of the bullet is bent upward where it first hit the wall, right 4 inches below my abdomen. But I kind of laughed because I thought, well, if that bullet had hit me, I'd been in the right place, right in our own hospital.
Did you see direct combat?
Yes.
Yeah, lots.
I was there during combat, and then I went for my last tour, which began in 1974, as the director of the covert NSA operation in Vietnam. And I was in Saigon when Saigon fell. Escaped under fire.
Were you in one of the last helicopters?
You bet I was.
Wow.
I went out in the dark and in the rain on the 29th of April. I went out on a Huey. I didn't go out on one of the big CH-53s. As soon as we were in the air, we were fired upon. We took so many slugs in the fuselage, I thought we were going down, but we didn't. We made it. And we flew out to the 7th Fleet that was cruising out in the South China Sea, and that's where I got off the helicopter.
Did you get along really well with all the other men in your troop?
Yes, you have to get along in close quarters. A person who can't get along will have problems.
oh yeah, we were close. And you develop a closeness in that kind of environment because you're trusting your life to these other guys. And if you don't have some level of trust, it just isn't going to work.
Oh, yeah. We were all in the same boat. We were scared. We were doing the right thing, we thought.
got very close to the nurses, doctors, corpsmen. In fact, we still have reunions every 2 years. Somewhere in the country we'll get together and have a reunion and just be with each other.
I go to reunions today. That bond is still there, very, very strong. So easy to get along with those from that sense.
My job as a captain was to command a rifle company which consisted of 4 of these platoons and a headquarters, and that's commanded by a captain. So my relationship with the soldiers was on a daily basis. I was responsible to feed them, to get them from point A to point B, to give them tactics on what to do, get them transportation, get them letters, and when they were in harm's way, it was my job to try to get them out of harm's way.
Going back to the United States after Vietnam, did you feel any type of emotion?
Guilt. I still remember this, you know, because the day before, I'm out in a firefight, right, with my guys. And the next morning, they put you in a helicopter, they fly you to, in our case, we went to Da Nang, where they had a civilian chartered airliner, engines running because they kept shooting at them. And you'd walk up those, you know, the steps like to an airplane, and I remember stopping at the steps of the airplane and looking around. Turn around, you could hear the artillery in the distance, you see the planes taking off, you could hear the guns going off, and then you step into the aircraft. It's air conditioned, it's clean, you're clean, and they start giving you food and drink, whatever you wanted. It's like going, I've always compared it to like a time portal. I don't know if you've seen the science fiction shows like Star Trek where they go through a time portal and they're in a different time. It's exactly what it was.
A real sense of relief when I left. I was on a ship at the time, and my roommate and I had left together. And we went out, we got in a helicopter, and they flew us ashore to Da Nang, and then from there we spent a couple days, and then they put us on a big airplane, took us to Okinawa. We spent a week or so in Okinawa, and then they put us on an airplane and we flew back to the States. It was when we got back to the States that things got difficult because this country wasn't behind us.
How did you feel when coming home? Like, what did you expect?
Not what we got.
We were treated pretty shabbily when we came home.
The airport was spit on personally. That is not an unusual event at the time.
They told me, don't wear your uniform. I landed at Travis and immediately changed into civilian clothes. They said, do not wear your uniform because you'll be spit on. So I never wore my uniform in public.
I got spit on by a woman in the airport. I really wanted to punch her, but you know, Marine officers really can't do that sort of thing, so I just had to grit my teeth and walk on. But that's the kind of treatment that we encountered when we came home. And we came home as individuals. We didn't come home as a group.
People despise the veterans because of the Vietnam War, and I don't see why they took it out on veterans. We were just doing our job.
The damage was so great, both to us and to everybody else. And until you've been sitting next to a guy and supporting him and warning him about what the enemy is going to do, and they would then watch him to be shot to death in really ghastly, horrible ways. I don't think you can understand the monstrousness of war until you have targeted a guy who was over the hill. And then you go over the hill and you find his body and you find letters from his wife on his body and pictures of his children. I don't think you can understand the horror of war.
What was your inspiration for your original design of the memorial?
Basically, the reason this whole memorial really got built is I got some really smart people involved with this. I got a bunch of the graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point who were smart to begin with, but I got the very smartest of those, the ones who were selected to go to the Harvard Business School. Back to the design, we had to decide what are the elements that will guide this competition. We will let everyone compete for this design. And we really felt that we needed a place that was reflective, contemplative, and that emphasized the horizontal. So in between the big vertical monuments of Washington and Lincoln, you have this horizontal memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial.
This one here has a little diamond through it. That means his remains were returned. this fellow here, Daniel Bora, who was probably a pilot, almost all these guys were pilots, came back from Vietnam. Years later, they found his remains. There were eight women killed in action in Vietnam, so their names are engraved on the wall. The Vietnam Women's Memorial, and this was dedicated in 1994.
Is war worth it? No.
I would not have regretted not going. One of the common things that we see is people come up to and say, I say, were you in the service? They say, oh yeah, I was in the service. I say, they say, oh, but I didn't do anything. I was stationed in Germany, or I was stationed here. As if that was something wrong. And I always try to tell them, are you joking? I mean, count your blessings. You didn't have to go. I said, that was terrific.
You kind of go through your head whether or not you did the right thing. You do think about it, you know, certain guys especially, whether or not you made the right choices.
I was glad when the war was finally over. And when they finally accepted the fact that the Marines and the soldiers of the war were good people. They weren't the bad ones.
Here's some of the medals they give you. That's a Purple Heart, so they gave you for being wounded in action. This is Silver Star, which they give you for doing your job, valor.
For the veterans, just know that our society has changed and people care now. The young people that are coming out of uniform today are going to find a different place than I found when I came back, and so that's a good thing.
Being a soldier or a Marine or a sailor is a matter of great honor. It means you're being called upon to risk your life for the good of the country. That is a singular honor. So if you're going to join, or if you're going to be a part of it, do it to the very best of your ability, because you are doing something that is so honorable.